Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Welcome everyone to Nightlight Part 2, which should be renamed the Mark and Mark Show for tonight. The mommy of Goldie and Ziggy wants to know which Mark is the evil twin. Anyhow, he's back. Not talking about the mysterious heavy breather from last week. I'm talking about my long-distance neighbor, Mark Dawidziak. He was one of the callers a couple weeks ago during the 10-minute Twilight Zone testimonials hosted by Arlen Schumer. Mark has been a Nightlight guest a couple of times to discuss his book on Kolchak, the Night Stalker, which has a direct impact on this journalism career I've had going on for 10 years. Better not say Barbara's my Tony. Maybe Barbara's more like Miss Emily. Or could Barbara be more like Tony's unbelieving niece? We'll find out more as the show develops. And Mark also covered his book on the beloved Shawshank Redemption movie. During those two shows, Mark and I touched on his book, Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone. The expanded version recently became available, and if you'd like to learn more about Mark, you can go to his website, markdawidziak.com. That's MarkDawidziak.com. Hi, Mark. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me back. I guess I passed the audition the first time, huh?
Yeah, I'd say so. You're just a terrific guest, and just like so many people from the Twilight Zone conferences, multi-talented, have interest in all kinds of areas, and you present the material in a captivating way. So I'm just glad to have you on. I mean, I think we just kind of get into all kinds of things. I actually have some ideas lined up, but you're also talented enough where I could just say, I'm going to go make a sandwich. I'll come back and
we'll make one for
tell
me
you
too
when the
if you
show's over. Yeah.
but should I put my order in now?
but yeah, first of all, over the weekend, I saw you put your Monsterama conference up on YouTube. It was a lot of fun watching you, Reba, another Mark, and Anne, doing your little hour-long discussion. It was just fun just being in the audience and hearing how Rod Serling impacted your lives. But you made a comment in a really fancy setting. I was like, oh wow, okay. Book sales must have been going really well, and then you told us where you were, and I was like, oh okay, well, that's even more impressive. So, can you tell us about your weekend trip? I thought that was really a lot of fun.
It was actually longer than a weekend. We spent about a week there. And where we were was when the started. The other Mark was Mark Scott Zachary, who wrote the Twilight Zone Companion, and he said, "Is that your house?" And I laughed and I said, I wish," because I was sitting in the library of a place in upstate New York in Elmira called Quarry Farm. And Quarry Farm is where Mark Twain spent his summers. He would pack up he lived in Hartford for most of the most productive years of his life. He built this fantastic house in Hartford. He built a house which was somewhat after his own image. It's a very eccentric house, and it has been restored to its great glory. And so if you want to visit Hartford at some point and see this house, I strongly recommend it. It's been described as part Victorian mansion, part steamboat, and part cuckoo clock. And that's not a bad description. Twain was, when they lived in Hartford, he didn't get a lot of writing done in Hartford. Those were social months. They would entertain almost constantly. There was an endless stream of guests. He did some writing there, but the real writing was done at Quarry Farm, which was his sister-in-law's farm in Elmira. Sue Crane, who was his wife's sister, had a working farm, and with this wonderful house on the top of a hill, which overlooked Elmira and the Chemung River, and she built him a study, a little freestanding octagonal study, which was a little bit away from the house, up on a bluff and overlooking the river. And it was in that study that he wrote most of the great books. That's where the majority of Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer and Life on the Mississippi, and Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court, the majority of those books were written in this octagonal study, which was built as a replica of the pilot house on a steamboat on the Mississippi River. So she created this wonderful working environment for him, and he could be very close to the family, but yet at a remove in silence, and it was wonderful. It was a wonderful place to create, and that house stayed in the possession of the Langdon family, which was Mark Twain's in-laws, and then the Langdon family set up a trust for it to be the center for Mark Twain studies. It's not open to the public, but it is open to scholars and writers and residents. And I gave a talk there. I gave a lecture there last week, and if you're one of the invited lecturers, you get to stay in the house. It's your house for while you're there. So my wife and daughter and I all stayed in this incredible house, and it's not the first time. This was our fourth time staying in the house. So we've gone back. Becky was about 5 years old, I think, the first time we went. So we've gone back at a rate of about every 5 years or so, and it was amazing. It's an amazing place, and it was an amazing place to do the Twilight Zone panel from. But I feel like I've been talking about spooky subjects, let's say, because the topic of the talk I gave at the Center for Mark Twain Studies was Mark Twain Meets Dracula. That was the title of the talk, and it was only a little bit facetious because behind it was a lot of scholarship, which starts with the notion of, does Mark Twain make a cameo appearance in Bram Stoker's novel Dracula? Does he show up in some way? Did Stoker sneak him in? And the answer is yes, he did. And but you have to know.
What's the proof?
Well, you have to know enough about Bram Stoker and enough about Mark Twain and enough about Dracula to put all of it together. But there is a moment in the book where Van Helsing has the great vampire hunter has marshaled the troops around him. He has brought all the vampire hunters, Jonathan Harker and Quincy Morris and Arthur, and he has assembled them and he's telling them all about Dracula's powers and his weaknesses. He's telling them what a vampire is, basically. He's spelling it out. And at one point, one of them, I think it's Dr. Seward, says, you're asking us to believe the impossible. And Van Helsing says, I know of an American who says that faith is believing what you know ain't so. And I follow that man. He's referring to Mark Twain. The quote is in a book called Following the Equator, which Twain was working on while he was living in London at the exact same time that Stoker was putting the finishing touches on Dracula. And so there's absolutely no question in the Dracula scholar's mind that Van Helsing is quoting Mark Twain in that piece. But the paper went on to talk about this incredible friendship that Bram Stoker and Mark Twain had, which is not very well known and not very, very much explored or written about. But they were friends for a long time. I did not know that. Huh. And they had a great interest in ghost stories. They had a great interest in supernatural stories, and they loved delighting each other with there's records of them sitting around talking over meat pies and beer and exchanging ghost stories. So so this is a great friendship. It's a very that lecture is archived right now, and you can watch it if you'd like, or listen to it and watch it, because there is a PowerPoint presentation that goes with it, and that's up at the Center for Mark Twain Studies website right now. So, that was the talk I was giving, and then while I was at Quarry Farm, I was scheduled to be on the Twilight Zone panel, so I decided to do it in the library, which was this amazing room with this very dark oak-lined walls and shelves, and it had a very Vincent Price look to it. When we started, I felt like say good evening, everyone, and it just had a very atmospheric one. I knew it was the perfect place to do the discussion of the Twilight Zone from. So, and that was one of two panels I did for Monster, because I also did the panel on Dark Shadows for Monsterama. So I've been talking, so for the past week, I've talked about Mark Twain, Dracula, Bram Stoker, Twilight Zone, and Dark Shadows. So, and you can go in any direction you want, Mark. Any one of those topics is up for grabs, as well as Night Stalker and everything else.
Yeah, I was planning on it, the Bram Stoker and Mark Twain friendship, that caught me by surprise. Did not know that. But,
Bram Stoker had an amazing circle of friends. Bram Stoker is one of these guys that we don't really know that much about him. You can, if you want. I mean, there was an outstanding biography of Stoker published just a couple years ago by David J. Scull called Something in the Blood. And it is really an amazing work on Stoker. But Stoker is kind of a shadowy figure. We don't know. And one of the reasons is that, one, Stoker wrote 18 books. you know. Now, as I say in the talk, Bram Stoker wrote 18 books. Question. Tell me another one. Can you do it?
No, I know there's...
And there are a couple of sort of second, like Lair of the White Worm, and which was made into a film by Ken Russell. There's another one called Duel. Yes, Duel of the Seven Stars, which is an early Mummy novel, and there have been 4 film versions of that, including one called The Awakening with Charlton Heston. But again, you know, Bram Stoker isn't like Charles Dickens, where if I see, okay, Charles, name me some titles that Charles Dickens people, Tale of Two Cities, Oliver Twist, David Copperfield, Great Expectations, A Christmas Carol, Bleak House. Mm-hmm. You could go on and on. Mark Twain, Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, Life on the Mississippi. You come down to Bram Stoker and you say, okay, Bram Stoker, Dracula.
That's
and
it, yeah.
Very, very few people can name any of the other books that he wrote. So he's kind of a one-hit wonder in a way, a literary one-hit wonder. And this also, he's kind of a shadowy because in his lifetime, he was not even best known as a writer. You know, it's like, well, what was he best known for? Well, he was best known as the manager of the Lyceum Theatre in London. And what was the Lyceum Theatre in London? The Lyceum Theatre in London was the home theater of Sir Henry Irving. And who's Sir Henry Irving? And I get the same thing. It's like saying to when I give talks on vampires, and I say this. I say, Sir Henry Irving. Nobody knows who I'm talking about. And then I say, okay, well, now I've got to stop and explain Sir Henry Irving to you. And I say, okay, let's do it this way. Take the who you think are maybe the 10 most popular actors on the planet, you know, whoever they might be, whether that's Will Smith or Harrison Ford or Chris Pine or Chris Hemsworth or anybody named Chris you want to name. Just take any 10 of them, put them all together, multiply them by 10, and you still wouldn't have Sir Henry Irving. That's how big Sir Henry Irving was. In fact, he was the first actor to be Sir anything. He was the first one. There's no other. He's the first one to be knighted. He's the first one to go down on one knee in front of a monarch, have his shoulders tapped by a sword, arise, Sir Henry Irving. That's how big he was. I mean, Mark, this guy was so big that when he died in 1905, the funeral was at Westminster Abbey. And it just doesn't get any bigger than Westminster Abbey. That's where they bury the kings and queens. And that's
Dickens.
How big he was. Yes, Dickens is there. And here's the thing. If you had attended that funeral in 1905 and you had suggested that 115 years later, a professor at a university could stand in front of a class of students at a major American university and say the name Sir Henry Irving, and not one person would know who you were talking about, you would have been thrown out of that abbey speaking heresy. But then if you'd had the temerity to go the next step and suggest that his manager, Bram Stoker, would be better known than Sir Henry Irving, you wouldn't have been thrown out of that abbey. You would have been laughed out. And that's because Bram Stoker did indeed eclipse the greatest actor on the planet at that moment. And he did it by writing a book that was bigger than himself. An amazing book. Dracula is just a book that won't quit. And it is just that good. And that book is about a potentially immortal creature. And that is how Bram Stoker secured a level of immortality for himself by writing that one incredible book. Mm-hmm. Now, in his lifetime, Bram Stoker maintained friendships with a staggering number of writers and poets and statesmen. He was known and trusted seemingly by everybody. And if I told you just a few of the people who Bram Stoker counted as friends and who people depended on, we would be here the rest of the night. But I've already told you he was friends with Mark Twain. Well, he was also friends with another major American literary figure, and that's Walt Whitman. Whitman thought Bram Stoker was just an amazing man. They met in Camden, New Jersey at Whitman's cabin. They exchanged letters for years and years, and there was a mutual admiration society. So we're talking Walt Whitman and Mark Twain. Now, it just doesn't get any bigger than that when it comes to American literary figures of the late 1800s. But then shift and go over to the other side of the Atlantic. In England, he knew Oscar Wilde. As a matter of fact, Bram Stoker's wife, Florence, Oscar Wilde was a suitor for her hand before she married Bram Stoker. She settled. She decided to marry Stoker instead. And Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes. So you have got Arthur Conan Doyle and Oscar Wilde on one side of the Atlantic, and Mark Twain and Walt Whitman on the other. Tell me a better quartet than that. Find me a better. And I like we're just getting started. Lord Tennyson, W.S. Gilbert of Gilbert and Sullivan fame, Winston Churchill, Theodore Roosevelt. He knew George Bernard Shaw. He was at the heart of the London theatrical district. He was at the heart of the London society, and so he was known and admired and trusted by a staggering number of people. And Mark Twain happened to be one of them. So Stoker's this endlessly just as Dracula is an endlessly fascinating book, so is Stoker an endlessly fascinating writer, and he just gets more fascinating the more you learn about it.
When we've had Varla Ventura as a guest, we've covered her many of the tales she has in her vampire book, but she has one of it was a fragment from a chapter that didn't make it into Dracula, or it was like a scene that he wrote for a follow-up or something like that. She just reprinted this fragment. That just that book is the only title of his. And now that you mentioned Lair of the White Worm and the fragment in Varla's book, it's really interesting that you're tying all this together and making links to Mark Twain. Sounds like you have a fascinating presentation on this subject. That's one of the reasons why I like having you as a guest. You never know what you're going to talk about, but Oscar Wilde's Dorian Gray, that's pretty creepy book as well. Seems almost like a foreshadow of Night Gallery. Yeah, Dracula is kind of Dracula as a book is kind of the part of two different trilogies, horror trilogies, and if you put it all together, you've got an amazing collection of seminal horror. The one is it's one of the three seminal horror novels of the 1800s. The first being Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the second being Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and the third being published in 1897 is Dracula. But then there's like this second trilogy of those books are separated, by a good distance, because Dracula is published in the 1890s.
Jekyll and Hyde is the 1880s, and Mary Shelley's book is around 1820. So they're separated by a good deal. And if you throw Edgar Allan Poe in, you've kind of, those four are almost like the Mount Rushmore of horror writers of the 1800s. Not that they say there aren't a lot of important horror writers all around them, there are, but those four kind of chart up a little bit, basically because of the body of work and the fact that three of them wrote these landmark novels, and so much of modern horror comes off of that and Poe, but Poe's work is mostly short stories. So you get to the 1890s, and now you've got the second, what's like an English trilogy, or the British Isles, I should say, because both Stoker and Wilde were Irish. But you have this kind of British Isles trilogy where you have Henry James writing Turn of the Screw, Oscar Wilde writing Dorian Gray, and again Stoker writing Dracula. Those three books are very tightly grouped in when they were published. So, and Dracula is kind of the book that belongs in both trilogies. So but you put those five books in the work of Poe together, and that's a lot of very important horror literature. That's kind of the body of work right there. That's going to take us into the next century, and allow people like Algernon Blackwood and H.P. Lovecraft to take it to the next level, and then the writers of the 50s like Bradbury and Robert Bloch and Richard Matheson to take it to the next level. And it's the continuum that takes us to Stephen King and the writers of today. So Stephen King once said that we are all Poe's grandchildren, and that's not entirely wrong. That's not a bad quote.
That sounds like something he would say, and I'd have to agree with that.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, and it's interesting because maybe this is an exclusive. I don't know, because I haven't said this out loud on a show yet. At least with any depth. But the next book is going to be the next book is going to be on Edgar Allan Poe. The book I'm working on right now is a biography of Poe, and it'll be for St. Martin's, the same people who published the Twilight Zone book. And that's the book I'm deep in research and writing right now. And so, Poe is seminal. The interesting thing about Poe is, to me, one of the interesting things about Poe is, with Poe, it's always what you think you know, not what we actually know. There's so much of Poe's life which is shrouded in mystery, and not to mention his death. I mean, Poe has one of the great stage exits in literary history. Everybody always thinks Mark Twain's stage exit is the stage exit, and in many ways it is because Mark Twain was born with Halley's Comet in the night sky on November 30th, 1835, and he dies in April 1910 with Halley's Comet burning in the night sky. He comes in and he goes out with a comet. Well, that's the kind of thing which would not be out of place in Greek myth. That's the kind of thing that would not be out of place in a supernatural story. And he predicted it. The other part of that, the great part of it, is that a year before his death, Twain told an audience, I came in 1835 with Halley's Comet. It's coming again pretty soon, and I expect to go out with it. It'll be the greatest disappointment of my life if I do not go out with Halley's Comet. The Almighty has said, no doubt. Now here are these two indefinable freaks. They came in together. They must go out together. I'm looking forward to that. So he predicted it, and he did indeed die with Halley's Comet in the night sky. That's pretty good. But Poe dies and leaves us a double-barreled mystery in that he's missing for a few days before his death. And we don't know what happened to him. There are a lot of theories, but we have no idea what happened during those missing days, and we have no idea what killed him. There are endless theories about what Poe died of. Encephalitis, rabies, alcoholism, a brain tumor, exposure. There's just there are endless theories. And the truth is, we'll never know, because the birth certificate, the death certificate, there is no real death certificate. The attending doctor changed his story. He's an unreliable witness. And the symptoms that Poe died of fit a staggering number of possible death mechanisms. So we're never going to know what Poe died of. And he leaves us, he dies under terrible circumstances. So he dies in a manner which is reflective of the two literary achievements that we still know him for. He's the father of the detective story, and he is the father of the modern horror story. He dies under circumstances which are certainly fit the horror story, and he leaves us with a double-barreled mystery. How good is that? So Poe is this, but the interesting thing about Poe, and it goes back to something you said before about, you said something about my interest. Most of the horror writers of those ones we were talking about are the 1800s. Mary Shelley, Poe, Robert Louis Stevenson, Bram Stoker. If you had said to them, oh, you're a horror writer, because that's kind of, how a lot of people remember them, Poe in particular. If the stereotype of Poe is sort of the hunched over, hollowed-eyed, slightly mad figure up in an attic, dashing off stories with a raven perched on his shoulder and a black cat at his right hand and a bottle of cognac on the table, and that's what it is. It is a stereotype. It's a myth. Poe is a very careful writer and a very careful craftsman. And his writing, I love people who say to me, when I tell them, my interest in Poe, or that I'm writing a biography of Poe, they'll say, oh, I love Poe. I've read everything he's ever written. I say, really? You've read all 17 volumes? And they kind of look at you like, what are you talking about? Well, Poe's collected work, it is 17 volumes. And very, very little of it falls into the horror or crime category. He wrote a lot of criticism. He wrote essays. He wrote early science fiction. He wrote a lot of humor. A lot of his pieces are humorous pieces, satires, and hoaxes. And believe me, nobody thinks of Edgar Allan Poe comedy writer. But he had a great sense of humor, and that's something we don't attribute to him. We don't think of Poe as a funny guy, but he was a funny guy, and it comes out in a lot of his writing. Kind of reduced Poe to the brand. We've kind of taken this multi-talented writer, this very complex writer, and we've reduced him to the sort of the master of the macabre, the godfather of all things goth. We've reduced him to the brand, and that's a very 20th century American conceit, to sort of identify something, almost like scientists have got to put a bug under a pin and be able to label it and say, this is what this is. This guy is a horror writer. This guy is a Western writer. That director does this, or that director does that. And it makes the people who sort of bounce around and do a lot of different things, it makes it very difficult for people to sort of wrap their mind around them. I had this discussion with Bill Nolan a few years ago, and Bill Nolan is he was right there with that group of writers, which was called The Group, which is the California group. They all hung around at Ray Bradbury's house, but it was people like Ray Bradbury and Richard Matheson and Charles Beaumont, and Bill Nolan was friends with all of them and knew them all. And he's kind of, some people are probably right now going, Bill Nolan, I know that name. William F. Nolan, I know that name. Well, he did landmark science fiction. He co-wrote Logan's Run. He wrote a lot of Dan Curtis's movies. But Bill also has done a lot of other things. He's written sports books. He's done books on race car driving. He's written film biographies. He's written mysteries. He's a Dashiell Hammett expert. He's done landmark work on Dashiell Hammett. He's an amazingly versatile writer, and Bill told me once that he thought that if he had stuck to one thing like Stephen King, he would have had a much more successful career, and he would have been better known. That he wasn't a specialist, and I thought I kind of but you're not built that way. You don't get to make that choice, and that's kind of not a choice that writers ever had to make historically. That's a very modern thing where you have to brand yourself and say, I'm a horror writer or I'm a mystery writer or whatever. So, if you had said to Poe, you're a horror writer, he'd have looked at you and said, what are you talking about? Oh, you mean I write Gothics? Is that what you mean? And then he still wouldn't have understood it because he wrote horror stories because that's what would sell. And there were magazines that wanted that sort of thing. He primarily viewed himself as a poet more than anything else. And he also looked at himself as an essayist and a critic. And the same thing with Robert Louis Stevenson. He wouldn't have known what you meant if you said that he was a horror writer. He would have just said, today I'm writing Treasure Island. Tomorrow I'm writing A Child's Garden of Verses. And the next day I'm going to write something called The Body Snatcher or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I'm just going to tell the story the best way. And if it happens to be the best way is to tell a supernatural story, that's the way I'll tell it. And if it's the best way is to tell it as an adventure story, like Treasure Island, that's the way I'm going to tell it. But they would have never thought of themselves in that restricted a way. And, and that's something which, has really worked against Poe, is seeing Poe clearly, because Poe is hidden by the stereotype, by the myths and the misconceptions. Like somebody once said to me, Poe, didn't he die drunk in the gutter? I said, no part of that statement's true. Not one part of that statement is true. And yet there's a lot of people that think it is true and say, that's how Edgar Allan Poe died. So Poe is this guy who, if you want to understand him as a horror writer and why he was so good at and he was good. I mean, there's a reason those stories, we still remember him as the master of the macabre, is because he was really that good at it. But in order to understand that, you have to understand the whole person, Dan, that came out of something. And you can't separate that out and say, I'm just going to pull that out, and that'll be Poe for me. That'll explain Poe for me. Well, if you do that, then you don't even begin to understand who Edgar Allan Poe was. And, and that's true of any horror writer. That's true of any, you have to know the whole person. And, one thing is, I have probably interviewed, most of the major horror writers of the last 40 years. So, I've had and been friends become friends with some of them, like Richard Matheson. And the one thing that I have observed about people who do horror, whether we're talking directors or writers, and even to a certain extent actors, the one thing I've noticed about them is they all have great senses of humor. And, and as Stephen King once said to me, well, of course, if you didn't have a sense of humor and you did this kind of thing, you'd go nuts. It would drive you crazy. You have to have a sense of humor. It is part of the basic kit you need in order to write horror. Robert Bloch, who wrote Psycho, was a very funny guy. And I remember saying to him how, horror writers, had said they were funny off stage. They were funny in just talking to them. Comedians don't tend to be funny away from the microphone. They tend to be very quiet and introspective away from the microphone. And when I said that about horror writers to Robert Bloch, he said, "Yeah, and we're funnier too." And he was just that quick. I mean, he was just very funny. And something that Stephen King said about horror writing. He said, it's cathartic. Horror writing, we take our nightmares and we work through them on the printed page, and then we give them to you. It's your problem now. We're done with them. We've sort of exorcised the demons through the stories, and now it's your problem. And which is a thinking that Robert Bloch very much ascribed to. And Bloch, who studied Poe's life and work, and could relate to Poe on a lot of levels because of what he did and what he wrote. I remember, Robert Bloch once said to me that nobody thinks of Edgar Allan Poe as a guy who his mother-in-law called Eddy. But that was who Poe was. He was a guy, who split his pants playing leapfrog with his wife in the front yard. That's Poe. And you can't separate that Poe, that guy, the guy who was Eddy, the guy, who had a lot going on in his brain, which is what great interest in. It's like something Vincent Price was in. And Vincent Price is an actor who was very much associated with Poe's work. Not a lot of the films were at all faithful to Poe, but some of those Roger Corman films are still excellent and very entertaining. But Price was devoted to Poe as well. And Vincent Price once said that the man who limits his interests limits his life. That is an excellent description of Edgar Allan Poe. Price wasn't talking about Poe at the time, but he basically described Edgar Allan Poe. Poe is interested in everything. And that is one of the things that made him such a good horror writer, is because he was drawing from this endless curiosity about everything around him and searching for answers in everything around him. And it made him an incredibly perceptive observer of the world, the natural world, and also his fellow human beings. Poe's stories are almost Freudian. Long before we had the term Freudian, is that they're almost case studies in psychoses and obsessions. And so Poe was this great observer. The mistake we make is in confusing Poe with his narrators. And it's the first thing that people tend to do. And when you get Poe in junior high school and high school, there's a tendency to say, well, the guy who wrote The Telltale Heart, that narrator is Poe. No, it's not. It's got nothing to do with Poe. And you're selling Poe short as a writer if you sort of say, that's great. He's not the narrator of The Cask of Amontillado. He is not the guy in The Fall of House of Usher. That's not who Poe was. And it's too easy to sort of just make that shorthand. So anyway, I one of the things I want to do with this book, if you hadn't guessed it already, is I want to knock and many myths and misconceptions that surround Poe and keep us from seeing him clearly about who he was.
Okay. You're welcome to be a guest whenever it comes out. We'll book you now.
That'll be for a while yet, but you want to pencil that in? As you can tell, I'm always ready and happy to talk about. One thing that's kind of it's hard to find a common theme in my work because it does seem like it's all over the place. And I won't say that this is a common theme in saying that it exists in all of the books. But I would say it is a recurring theme, and that it runs through, is that I'm fascinated with writers and the writing process. I mean, we talked about Bram Stoker, we talked about Poe, we talked about Twain. I'm fascinated by writers and the writing process and where it comes from. Where does the creativity come from? Where does the dynamic tension? It's one of the things, that drew me to the Twilight Zone was the excellence of the writing and Rod Serling and Richard Matheson, these wonderful writers. So that is a sort of a continuing thing. Fascinated with, a lot of my books sort of center on writers. The Twilight Zone, at its heart it's in many ways a tribute to Rod Serling. And I wrote a book on Dracula. I wrote the Bedside Bathtub and Armchair Companion to Dracula, which is, largely about the book and the creation of the book, although it embraces all things Dracula, all the films and TV stuff and all of the merchandising and all of the various ways we see Dracula, which is endless. It's a fascinating thing. And I'll stop there just for a second since we're talking Halloween. I'll make a point here, which is one of the things that absolutely fascinates me with Dracula. One of the reasons we're still talking about this book, and one reason this book still haunts us, is Stoker came up with like the perfect horror metaphor, not only with the vampire but with that vampire, with Dracula. Dracula is a book which has been endlessly interpreted and reinterpreted metaphorically. Because with horror writers, there's always the question that lingers in the air, which is, what are they writing about? And I use this example when I talk about Stoker, and largely because Robert Louis Stevenson is another favorite author, and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is another favorite book. But I was once talking to a high school class, and the teacher had told me they had just recently read Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And I said, that's one of my favorite books. And I said, let me ask you a question. What is it about? And, these are high school kids. It takes a while, before a hand will timidly go up. And I said, and so finally, and I said, yes, and I got a student who stood up and said, well, it's about a scientist. That's a formula. He drinks the formula, and this monster comes out, and he can't. I said, whoa, wait, time. You're giving me plot. I didn't ask for plot. I said, what is it about? What do you think Robert Louis Stevenson was really writing about in this story about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? And now you can see they're kind of really thinking about this. And one student said, I think it's about alcohol. And I said, well, explain that. And I said, well, this is about a scientist, and it's a drink. And he drinks it down, and it brings this monster out that he can't control. And he becomes addicted to it. Well, that is a perfectly good metaphoric interpretation of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. There's nothing wrong with that interpretation. So, when that student got done, another student said, well, if it's about alcohol, maybe it's really about drugs. Because he makes the formula from drugs, and it's an impure drug that gets him in trouble, and he becomes addicted to that. And I said, that works too. Mm-hmm. Somebody else said, I think it's about the battle between good and evil in everybody, how there's a good part and an evil part in everybody, and they're in conflict. And what happens if one part dominates and the evil part finally emerges? That's good too, and it works. And some people think that Jekyll and Hyde is about man's response to God, which is, I didn't make me, you made me. Why am I to blame for the way I am? All of these interpretations metaphorically work. And so I said to the students, so let me ask you a question. Which is the right answer? And one of them said, all of them? I said, all of them and none of them. You're the only ones who get a vote. It's always horror. It's always about what you bring to the book. What dreams did you bring to the book? What aspirations? What fears? What nightmares? What hopes? All of those things are going to shape how you view and interpret the story. So here's Jekyll and Hyde with all of these wonderful interpretations. As much as I love Jekyll and Hyde, it is a shallow saucer compared to the ocean that is Dracula. Dracula has been interpreted and reinterpreted over and over again, and we constantly shape and reshape that metaphor to suit our needs. And this is what, to me, is endlessly fascinating about the character of Dracula. Dracula is part of yet another trilogy. 3 Victorian literary characters who are immediately recognizable, even by people who have never read the books that they appear in. 3 Victorian characters who walk the fog-bound streets of London. Ebenezer Scrooge in Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol. Sherlock Holmes in Conan Doyle stories, and Count Dracula. They are three of the most iconic and recognizable characters. If you show somebody the image of the popular image of Sherlock Holmes with the Inverness cape and the deerstalker and the bent pipe and say, who is that? Even people who have never read one Sherlock Holmes story are probably going to get it and say, that's Sherlock Holmes. If you show somebody the guy in the nightshirt and the nightcap with the candle and walking through the say, that's Ebenezer Scrooge. The difference is that our interpretation, our image of Scrooge, even though the actors who have played him their interpretations have been different. Scrooge mostly fits within the confines of a certain image that we have of him, and the same can be said of all the actors who have played Sherlock Holmes. Dracula never looks the same. Never. Christopher Lee looks nothing like Bela Lugosi. The Max Schreck in Nosferatu looks nothing like Jack Palance, who looks nothing like Frank Langella, who looks nothing like Louis Jourdan, who looks nothing like Gary Oldman. Every image, the face of Dracula changes so radically generation to generation that he's not even recognizable as the same character. You put the vampire from Nosferatu side by side with the vampire just 9 years later in Lugosi's Dracula, they don't even look like first cousins. So who's doing that? We are. Because we have different metaphoric needs generation to generation to bend that vampire to suit our needs at a certain time. And that's what we do. So this is one of the reasons we're still talking about Dracula. This is one of the reasons he so haunts the Halloween season. If there is one iconic image of Dracula, it's Lugosi. If you want, if you showed people the classic image of the guy in the tuxedo and the evening clothes and the cape and the widow's peak and the Hungarian accent, that would be the sort of the stereotype image of Dracula. And it's the one that everybody would probably go to first, even if they tell you that Christopher Lee is their favorite Dracula. It's the one that the image everybody universally recognizes and goes to. Generations of kids did not dress up as Christopher Lee to go as Dracula on Halloween. They went as Lugosi's idea of Dracula. And yet that does not in any way, shape, or form resemble the character in the book. It's polar opposite of how Stoker describes the character in the book. So while Scrooge and Sherlock Holmes always kind of meet our expectations, Dracula always blows them up. And I think it's very interesting part of the character, and I think it's why he's always going to be with us, because we just keep reinterpreting that story. And we keep bending and molding that story to what we need it to be at a certain time. And as I say, we don't do that with almost anything else. And that's the power of metaphor. And it's the power of metaphoric storytelling. And so much horror storytelling is predicated on metaphor. So that's this is why I could write an entire book on Dracula.
Well, while you were talking about Poe and the creation, his being one of the pioneers of the detective fiction, there's our breakfast buddy, Mark Olshaker. We're all sitting there talking, Johnny and Helen Holmes, and you autographed the book for my friend Celeste. So there's like so much of that. What's the word? But so many people from like the Twilight convention have these just wanting to understand the how to be better people, learn these lessons that are exemplified from the Twilight Zone episodes. The kind of people you want to avoid, by being deceived by the Howling Man and stuff like that. Okay, but even there are people like our friend Mark, who is like co-authoring these, like the Mindhunter book. That's like another example of all horror writers are Poe's grandchildren, but Mark's dealing with real case, like these are really beyond Halloween type of evil, creepy type people.
It does have a kinship with Poe, because Poe, a lot of Poe's creepiest stories are not supernatural. They actually could be just as easily classified as crime stories. Telltale Heart is a crime story. Cask of Amontillado is a crime story. There's nothing supernatural about them. The horror comes from the human animal. It's sort of like the argument about when Silence of the Lambs won Best Picture, and it became the first picture since it happened one night to sweep the 5 major Oscars. And people said, well, it's the first horror film to be named Best Picture. And that kind of, in some circles started the argument, well, is it a horror film? And, there's nothing supernatural, there's nothing paranormal, there's nothing, in that category. So, is it a horror film? And I would argue, yes, it is. It's a horror. If Psycho is a horror film, then so is Silence of the Lambs. That they both deal with the human monster and what the human monster is capable of. And Poe dealt with that as well. Poe, in some ways, dealt more with that than he did the supernatural. There are very few Poe stories which are truly supernatural in the sense that we think of horror stories today.
Like the House of Usher.
Yeah, I mean, there's some, but The Pit and the Pendulum is not a supernatural story.
Right.
Even House of Usher has a rational explanation to it if you wish to go that route. If you wish to view it through a supernatural lens, you can, but you can also view it as a purely things that happen. That the sister gets buried alive and she comes out, and that his hearing is acute, and the house happens to collapse at that moment. One does not have to put a supernatural interpretation on it. So when you look at it, Poe's stories, a lot of those stories that we deal as terror tales or horror tales, they could just as easily be classified as crime fiction. Now, I happen to think they are horror stories, because again, there are a few things more horrific than the human monster. And I think Poe understood that. And that comes right down to it. Mark Olshaker is a really good friend. And we both went to George Washington University, and we were about 4 years apart. And so we, I think the world of Mark, and matter of fact, I've interviewed him for the Poe biography because he had some wonderful insights into Poe as a writer, because of what he has done with John Douglas, with the Mindhunter series. But Poe is like, and this goes back to something, there's a big difference between what Poe did and what Rod Serling did. And this is where they divide. Poe's work. If we do sort of narrow it down to the two things he's best known for, the horror story and the mystery story, the detective story. The difference between those two is basically that the detective story, or what he would call the stories of ratiocination, using rational thought to solve a crime, using logic and scientific method to solve a crime. That story, which is going to lead us to Sherlock Holmes, as Doyle himself admitted, it was that Sherlock Holmes is basically a better, more jumped up version of Dupin and Poe's stories. But if you look at that story, the mystery story, the detective story, and one of my books is on Columbo, so I've kind of got one foot in this kind of mystery sleuth field. Those stories promise us one thing: they promise us answers, they promise us solutions, and it's a very comforting thing in a very upsetting world. This is, people will say, well, we need that more now than we ever needed it before. But people have been saying that for decades. People said that when the world was blowing up in the 1930s and nations were tilting towards fascism, and there was a depression, and there were soup kitchens and food and bread lines, and there was
the Dust
Bowl, and there was an ecological disaster going on, environmental disaster going on. People said it during World War II, when there was carnage on an unimaginable scale, and the secrets of the atom were revealed. People have said it, at every time. Everybody thinks their time is the worst possible time. And the detective story, it doesn't matter what decade it is, because you tell me the decade and I'll tell you, like something that was very upsetting going on at the time. And the detective story at each phase offers the comfort that there are answers, that there's a solution to things. And Poe, one part of Poe's brain that way. One part of Poe's brain was extraordinarily logical and thought he could figure things out. He could get to answers. The horror story sort of says it's a search for answers too, but you may not get the answers. The answers may be inexplicable. They may be bigger, insolvable mysteries. And so that's kind of the difference between the horror story and the mystery story. And that's an oversimplification, but it's true. And Poe worked both sides of the street. But I'm working both sides of the street. Poe believed one thing passionately, which was that the stories should not have a moral point of view. They should not have a moral, indeed. Poe wasn't big on it. Poe believed that effect, sound, rhythm, that was more important than anything else. And that if you professedly preached or presented a moral of some kind in the story, that was wrong. You shouldn't do it. And Poe, I think it's impossible to read The Mask of the Red Death and not thinking there's a moral point of view in The Mask of the Red Death. But some of Poe's stories, and William Wilson and a few others, definitely are cautionary tales. But Poe, in his essays about writing, sort of fled from the moral. Rod Serling did with the Twilight Zone was Rod Serling embraced the moral. Rod Serling believed, that the stories that were presented in the Twilight Zone, for the most part, should have a moral center and should have a point of view. So that's a big difference between Poe and Serling, and Serling read Poe. He was influenced by Poe. We know that, but as they all were, but they also approached things. They were very different writers from that standpoint, even though they were often plowing the same fields, if you will. They were different writers in the sense that while Poe tended to shy away from the moral, Serling embraced it, and Serling always which is why a book like Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone was possible. It was because there was, I not only do I think a book called Everything I Need to Know I Learned from Edgar Allan Poe would be a very short book, you wouldn't learn very much. What you learn would not necessarily be that valuable. You might learn how to dismember a corpse. But, Serling, the Twilight Zone gives you these endless, wonderful life lessons and morality tales. And that makes it very, very different. And horror tends to be a very moral genre. I think one of the reasons that Poe didn't write, he wrote one novel. And he didn't really go back to it very often. And it's not that I don't think Poe only lived to be 40. Rod Serling lived to be 50. Poe lived to be 40. Poe left behind a staggering amount of work for somebody who only lived to be 40 years old. 17 volumes of work. It's like the people who claim that, Poe was always drunk. I was like, no writer would ever make that argument because it's impossible. It is impossible to have written that much and been constantly under the influence of alcohol. And not to say he didn't have a problem with the bottle. Yeah, I believe that Poe was hypersensitive to alcohol. I think there's a great deal of evidence that suggests that one drink got Poe very drunk, and he was almost allergic to it. That he may not have drunk that much in volume, but one drink, and the descriptions of Poe drinking are like he would charge it down. He would not sip or savor. He would take a glass of wine or something and just in one gulp throw it down. And by the time it hit his stomach, he was roaring drunk. So Poe, but there are these long stretches where Poe doesn't drink, and he's doing an amazing amount of work. And any writer will tell you it's impossible to write, to summon the levels of concentration you need to write, and the powers of concentration and craftsmanship you need to write under the influence of alcohol or drugs. And so, I think that's one part of Poe's life, which is again, not so much that alcohol doesn't bedevil him; it does, and not that there aren't incidences where he's in the middle of incredibly self-destructive behavior because of alcohol. I don't think there's any question that it was. But I think the amount that he drank might be overstated because, again, he only lived to be 40, and he managed to write a great deal at a very high level. And that's just so. I mean, the difference to me between what Poe wrote and what Serling, and it's interesting because horror does tend to be a very moralistic genre. I mean, first off, horror. It's predicated on the notion that there is something that's evil. And it's also predicated on the notion that evil needs to be confronted in some way. Not that it'll always be defeated. Sometimes, a horror story ends with evil winning or evil being blunted. And sometimes it ends with the evil being defeated. But it's always sort of about the acknowledgement of evil and the confronting of it. And that's almost biblical, that's as a form. that is very near biblical. So I think that's one thing about and it's always about a search for answers of some kind. And I think we all feel that way. The difference between the detective story is the detective story is going to give you answers. It's going to order your universe for you. The horror story says maybe, maybe not. And the Twilight Zone, it's kind of miscategorized as a horror show because it really isn't. I mean, there are episodes which were horror episodes, and it certainly embraced horror. But and a lot of people have defined it as a science fiction series, and it really isn't that either. Certainly when you compare it to The Outer Limits, which was much more the science fiction series than the Twilight Zone ever was. But again, the Twilight Zone embraced science fiction. and it embraced fantasy. And so how do you define the Twilight Zone? Is it horror? Is it science fiction? Is it fantasy? Is it all of them? Is it none of them? And I think it comes down to the description, to the definition of the Twilight Zone is what Rod Serling gave us, that it's as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It's big enough to embrace all of those things, and yet it's its own thing. It's the Twilight Zone. And there's no better way to define it. And in that world, you are generally punished or rewarded for what you bring in. Most episodes of the Twilight Zone, the people who brought in all the small things, pettiness, ignorance, greed, bullying, people who abused children, people who abused older people. These are people you knew were going to take it in the shorts before the half hour was over. And by the same token, the people who brought in kindness and a loving nature and positive stuff, they tended to be rewarded for those things. And so, the morality of the Twilight Zone is something which is very, very strong. And, obviously something I'm very, very attracted to and have always been, I was first attracted to the Twilight Zone as a youngster just because I thought it was neat, just because I thought the storytelling was wonderful. I loved the spookiness of it. I loved that. I was a monster. We didn't have that term when I was growing up, Mark. The term monster kid. Adults now refer to themselves as that. Let's say, I was a monster kid. We didn't have that term back in the 1960s. If you were into horror as a genre, you were watching the old Universal horror films. You were watching The Twilight Zone and The Outer Limit Gallery and Night Stalker and Dark Shadows, and you were all sort of steeped in the same culture of the 60s, and you were all watching the same things, and you had a common language because of that.
Yeah, the Hammersmith, Dracula.
That's right. That's right.
That was me.
That now today, you can announce that you're a horror fan, and you could have 10 people announce that they're horror fans, and not one of them watch the same things or read the same things. The field is so big now, and we have horror to suit every taste, every kind of taste, every kind of age and demographic. We have horror tailored for every part of it. And, there was so little of it in the 1960s that we all tended to watch and share the same things. And, that was kind of wonderful in a way. It was like the equivalent of the whole culture was that, we were all watching the same 3 channels. We were all watching, we could be transformed by the same story. It's why when Night Stalker came along in 1972, and it got a 34 rating, which was, basically 34% of all the TV households in America were watching The Night Stalker that night. And then it got like a 54 share. And the share is the percentage of people actually watching television at a certain time, which means more than half were watching television when Night Stalker aired were watching that show. Well, getting that kind of numbers for anything now is impossible with the number of channels that exist, with the number of choices that exist, with the way people watch television now with streaming and everything else. It's impossible for one show or one movie or one thing to grab everybody's attention. And the term "everybody's watching it" lost its meaning a long time ago. And, The Night Stalker was an incredibly influential horror story because it came on at a point when that term meant something. When the next day, everybody at the water cooler at work, everybody on the playground at school, everybody was going, "Did you see that thing last night?" And remember, there's no VCRs, there's no DVDs, there's no recording, there's no way to make it up. If you didn't see it, you really missed out on something. The only chance you were going to see is maybe they would rerun it 6 months later or something like that. but that was your only shot to see it. So it was a very different world, and it was a world where all of this stuff was somewhat shared and swapped around. And Twilight Zone, that decade is an amazing decade because it does have Twilight Zone, it does have Dark Shadows, and then 72 is Night Stalker. So that's if you're alive on the planet and you're a horror fan, you probably were influenced by all three. You're probably aware of all three, were influenced by all three, and there's almost no way around them in that sense. And that's why they were so influential. They influenced the next generation that did this, and the generation after that. So we're still living under the influence of all things, and nothing could ever be that influential again. It's just because of the numbers, because we are so fragmented as a society. We are so our viewing, our entertainment choices are so fragmented. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, by the way, because there is no bad. There just is what it is. And any turn in technology, any turn in culture, you're going to get good things and you're going to get bad things. You're going to get things that are positive and you're going to get negatives out of it. And it's never a clear-cut win-win situation, and it's never a lose-lose situation. I mean, the great thing about the amount of technology we have now and the amount of entertainment we have now is diversity. We have many more voices being heard than were heard back in the 1960s. There are a lot more hands on the trigger of what culture is. So there's a lot more types of voices being heard. And that's fantastic. That's great. What we've lost is the common experience. You can't have both. You can't have both. So it's not that it's a good thing or a bad thing. It just is what it is. And there are a lot of people who say, boy, I wish it were like the 1960s again. And I'm thinking, well, there are a lot of great things about the 1960s. And you cannot judge an entire decade over all of the bad things that happened in it or all the good things. That's kind of a small mind that will do that. That will basically, like I say, if you look at the 60s and you say, oh, it's all love beat and peace signs, you're missing a lot of the noble things that happened in the 60s and all the great things that happened in the 60s. But there's also a lot of sexism in the culture and in the entertainment. There was a lot of misogyny. There was a lot of, I want to say to people, how would you like to go anywhere and just be assaulted by cigarette smoke? Because it was everywhere in the 60s. You could not get away from it. Restaurants were choked with smoke. There were no smoking sections. There were no smoking. You couldn't get away from it on airplanes. Couldn't get away from it in your own home and families. Every home had ashtrays. Who has ashtrays anymore? Every home in the 1960s had, every room had a collection of ashtrays. You show an ashtray to a kid now, they don't even know what you're looking at. And so it's not. It has nothing to do with there things have improved, and you win and you lose is basically what it is. And you live in your time, and you appreciate the good things that are in your time, and that's kind of the way you have to do it. Otherwise, you're just going to be one of these people who get old very fast and bemoan about why aren't things like the good old days. And I guarantee you there were things about the good old days which weren't very good. And I guarantee you if you look around, you're going to see things which you're going to love about now that you would have hated to do without, 20, 30 years ago. So, and again, I don't bemoan it. It's just like, I'm just saying that it is what it is. And I'm not one of those who basically, endlessly looks towards the past and says, gee, why aren't things like they were when the universe was well ordered for me, in my view.
And Mark, what you were talking about with the good and bad from this generation or this decade. There were some good things that came out of the 60s. It's the start of each of your chapters and your revised Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone. It just starts all. The chapters seem to start off like parents talking to a child, someone who has experience, just kind of leading someone into the theme of the grouping of certain Twilight Zone episodes, by themes. You might have 3 or 4 episodes that theme of the downfalls of greed or something like that, or all weaved together. That's one of the nice aspects of your expanded version of your book. I just really enjoyed the lead-ins to the several episodes, 150 some episodes that you cover in the book. One the other really interesting aspects of Twilight Zone book is, people like your friend Richard Matheson that came out of the 50s and 60s and continued to have a successful career throughout the following decades. You reminded me that he was the author of, or the screenwriter for Dreamer of Oz.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was a vastly underrated movie. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, in fact, I met Richard when he was doing that. That's how we met.
Okay.
There was a press conference at the Century Plaza Hotel. It was aired on NBC, and they had a press conference for it with John Ritter and Annette O'Toole and Cloris Leachman and Richard Matheson. And this was just about the time I was noodling around the idea of doing a book on the Night Stalker. So after the press conference, I introduced myself. And at this point, I actually knew I had known Ray Bradbury for several years. And I was hoping to do a book with Ray, and we were sort of doing something together. And then, the paths sort of diverged, and we just didn't get a chance to pursue that. I've got hours and hours of taped interviews with Ray sitting here in my office, and from that, and I would love to revisit that at some point. But I knew Ray very well, and I knew Harlan Ellison. I met Harlan when he was the creative consultant on the 1985 revival of the Twilight Zone. I met Harlan in the Twilight Zone, and we hit it off well. And Harlan and Ray were very good friends with Richard. So I actually met Richard last of those three. And my Shawshank book is dedicated to the three of them, dedicated to Ray, Harlan, and Richard. And but I met Richard last. And I met him in the late 80s when Dreamer of Oz was being done. And that's right about the time I was going to start work on the Night Stalker book. And that kind of led to a lot of discussions on the Night Stalker and his career, and then those discussions turned into an ongoing discussion, which lasted over the years. And you can think you're pretty hot stuff. You can think you've accomplished something, and you've made some contributions, and then you open a book and you see that Richard has mentioned you in the dedication of 2 of his books. And that'll pretty much flatten you when you see that. You part of your brain goes, well, I can retire now. that's a sufficient honor. I ended up being very, close to Richard, over the years. And, he was very sweet. I always say that he and Harlan were the polar opposites because, Richard was tall, Harlan was short. Although Harlan would have just accused me of making a heightist remark when I said that. But Harlan was on the short side, and Richard was on the tall side. Richard was very soft-spoken. Harlan, not so much. But they adored each other, and they adored each other's work. And they were 2 of the most important, genre writers. That although Harlan probably would come back and kill me for calling him a genre writer. Yeah. Harlan was one, like we were talking about before with Poe and Stevenson.
Mm-hmm.
Harlan, when I met Harlan in 1985, because CBS was doing the revival of the Twilight Zone, and I was the TV critic at the Akron Beacon Journal at the time. So the publicist on the Twilight Zone asked me, said, we're doing the revival of the Twilight Zone. Is there anybody connected with the show you want to talk to? And I didn't have to think twice. I said, yeah, I want to talk to Harlan Ellison. And they said, we can make that work. So at that point, I had read a fierce amount of Harlan's stuff. And I knew quite a bit about him, And I also knew that, an interview with Harlan was either going to be, a great memory or it was going to go off the tracks really fast. And because Harlan did not suffer fools gladly. And our relationship, the tone of our relationship was set right at the beginning because before I asked one question, Harlan said, all right, wait. There's one ground rule. And I said, yeah, I know. I can't call you a science fiction writer. And he said, God bless you. And I said, you don't believe in God. And he said, that's how much I mean it. So we sort of hit it off right from the start. Now, I got to explain that. It's not that Harlan was not proud of his science fiction writing. He certainly was. And he certainly was very pleased to be named a Grand Master in science fiction. What he did not want was his accomplishments as a writer completely defined and reduced to science fiction. So what Harlan did not want was to be written about as science fiction author Harlan Ellison. If you just restructured that sentence and said Harlan Ellison, who has written landmark science fiction, he'd have no problem with that. That was fine because it was true. But when, again, Harlan had the writer's mentality, which was if science fiction is the best way to tell a story, that's the way you tell it. If horror is the best way, that's the way you tell it. If mystery is the best way, that's the way you tell it. Harlan wrote essays, he wrote criticism, he wrote landmark TV criticism, movie criticism. Harlan was just a writer, and that's so he hated that kind of labeling and reduction that goes with it. And Richard wasn't crazy about it either, by the way. Richard hated being called a horror writer. And that's maybe the thing he was called most. He hated the description horror writer Richard Matheson. Now again, it's not because he wasn't proud of the horror writing he'd done. After all, Stephen King once said that Richard Matheson was the most influential writer on him. That it was the guy who taught him how to do it. But Richard, and Richard felt like it's fine to be working in the same fields with people like Mary Shelley and Robert Louis Stevenson and Shirley Jackson and people like that. He's very proud to be, in the same company as those people. What he hated was that the culture had taken the word horror and made it a synonym for slasher, especially in movies. that if you said you were doing a horror movie, people immediately thought slasher movie. And he thought that reduced what horror was to blood and guts, you know. And that bothered him. That really bothered him. So he didn't like to be called a horror writer, but mostly because of what the connotation was, you know. And also, you know, Richard was a deceptively versatile writer. He wrote Westerns. People don't know that. He wrote really good Westerns, and he wrote for some Western series. You know, and he wrote, obviously, stuff that was fantasy. He also wrote science fiction, and he also wrote, you know, just flat-out horror stories. So, you know, Richard's not that easy to pin down either in all of this. And, you know, I don't think Richard, you know, I once said to him, you know, why did you start writing horror? You know, I know, you know, you always sort of look where the dynamic tension is and where the creativity comes from with writers. And, you know, when Richard got out of college, he was in World War II. He was in the Battle of the Bulge. He suffered frostbite in the Battle of the Bulge, and you know, both he and Rod were in different theaters because Rod was in the South Pacific. He's a paratrooper, and he came back very scarred from the war. And Richard was in the European theater, and he came back very scarred from his war experiences. And they both headed to college. They both, you know, and Rod headed to Antioch in Yellow Springs, Ohio, with sort of the vague notion of perhaps being a physical education teacher, working with kids. He wasn't thinking about being a writer. You know, he wasn't going there at all. And Richard went to college, and he majored in journalism. But the whole idea of majoring in journalism was the notion of finding a way to support yourself with writing while you were doing other kinds of writing. But they both kind of worked through trauma, and Rod discovered writing at Antioch, and he discovered that he could work through his war experiences through writing. And then Richard discovered that he could work through not only his war experiences, but also a overwhelming sense of alienation that was part of a lot of his early stories. If you're looking through a sort of a common theme in Richard's early work, the notion of the loner, I mean, what is I Am Legend about? If it's not about the ultimate outsider, the ultimate loner, one man in a world full of vampires, fighting a world full of vampires. If that ain't alienation, I ain't heard it. The Shrinking Man, you know, about somebody who is literally withdrawing from the human race, is another case of alienation. And this notion of the loner up against the impossible odds. Duel, you know, is a great story that Steven Spielberg makes. The one man up against this faceless, monstrous truck. This symbol of oppression. Night Stalker, Kolchak, up against not only a vampire but an entire bureaucracy and corrupt city government that wants to suppress him and works against him. This is all of these stories about these outsiders and loners and things. Richard was working through something, and he said so. I mean, you know, when we talked about this, he said, you know, that there was a very powerful sense of in him, and he had to work through it. He had to work through it in his writing and personally too, and he did. He did that. That theme somewhat goes away later on in his writing because he did sort of cathartically deal with it. But both Rod and Richard come back from the war, and you know, Rod starts to write for live television. So he's not writing sort of what we would call genre fiction in any way. He's writing almost Arthur Miller type stories for live television, and that becomes his outlet, and that's where he ascends very, very quickly to the head of his profession as a television writer. He's one of what they call the angry young men of live television. Richard makes his name selling to the pulp magazines, which were around then, Amazing Stories and Amazing Fantasy. And I once asked him, you know, why did you start writing horror stories and science fiction stories? And he said, because that's what would sell. There were outlets for those in the 50s. There were all those magazines, and you knew you could sell to them, which is a very Edgar Allan Poe-like answer. Why did Poe write those things? Because there were magazines in his time, and he knew he could make his name writing these very sensational Gothic stories. And it's not that he thought that this was going to be his great literary achievement. In fact, there's very good evidence he didn't. And if Poe had inherited all the money he thought he was going to inherit from his stepfather, and he ended up being cut off without a cent. But if John Allen had given Poe all the money that Poe thought he was going to get, Poe probably turns into a gentleman poet. He probably, if he lived the life of a genteel, gentrified Southern aristocrat, he's probably going to write poetry and he's probably going to write essays, but he's probably never going to write the horror stories because there won't be any need for it. And he's probably not going to write the detective stories either. And we probably don't get Edgar Allan Poe. What I'm telling you is life takes its hand. John Allen didn't do Edgar Allan Poe any favors by not giving him any money, but he did do us an enormous favor by cutting him off, because that's what led Poe to discover how good he was at these stories of terror and crime. And, Richard Matheson, he discovers that these horror stories are great metaphoric devices for working through the trauma that he had experienced as an individual and through the war, and Rod does the same thing. So the war takes its hand in this. If we don't have World War II, maybe we don't get Rod Serling and Richard Matheson. Maybe Rod does become a phys ed teacher. Maybe Richard becomes a journalist. But, they both had a need, and they were shaped by what was happening at the time, and they responded to it. So, you're always shaped by your times. You can't write a sonnet without being influenced by your times. And so, with all of them, you sort of get the fact that whatever was happening in the culture, whatever was happening historically, it affected them profoundly. And they responded by giving us these wonderful gifts of these stories that they pursued. So, and they each had a different way of doing it.
Mark, since it's interesting to read, and just say your Everything I Need to Know book, and hear you talk, and probably 99.9% of us, listening to you, never met Ray Bradbury or Richard Matheson, but you're giving us such an insight into their creativity, and with Richard, he wrote some of the most memorable Twilight Zone episodes. I think 20,000 or Nightmare at 20,000 Feet. One of the there's a lot of dialogue in the Nightmare episode. The little girl lost, but there is the Invaders episode, which basically it's basically a silent movie, other than Agnes Moorehead, panting after swinging an axe at the little alien creatures, and there's really not too much dialogue in Duel. And so he's very proficient at creating a story with just action. It seems like taking a chance on developing something where there's really not much to say in Duel. It's just more of the story he wrote, and then you get Dennis Weaver's responses. He thought he beat the truck. As he started coasting down the hill, and he thought the truck didn't make it up the hill, whatever. And then all of a sudden the truck appears in the rearview mirror, and you get all these glad to terrified expression. It's he really pulled off a lot of genres that most writers would have a difficult time achieving, but Richard was really a standout in being so versatile. Can you talk a little bit more about that aspect of him?
Forever. One thing I'll point out immediately is about the Invaders and Nightmare at 20,000 Feet. As different as those two episodes are, and they're two of his most memorable episodes of the Twilight Zone, there we have it, the loner against the big odds again, right? They're just two different types of loners. Agnes Moorehead is literally alone in her farmhouse when this invasion occurs, and William Shatner's character in Nightmare at 20,000 Feet is the one person who sees the danger, and nobody believes him. He's the one guy against the impossible odds. So there it is. And one's very talky, and the other has almost no dialogue at all. But what they have in common, and what all of Richard's writing has in common, is this is one way Richard is closer to Poe than Serling is too. Is Richard he always used just what he needed and nothing more when he wrote. His writing is a model of incredible efficiency. There's an old saying with writers, which is that, once you're done with your first draft and you can go back and you get rid of all the needless words. And they're like, what are the needless words? Well, they're all the words you don't need. They're all the words that, that literally, or things you don't need. Scenes, and there's an expression among writers called murdering the babies, which means getting rid of something you really love that you wrote, but it hurts the book. It may be the best thing you wrote, but it doesn't belong in the book, or it hurts the pacing, or it slows down the pacing. So you got to murder that moment. You got to murder something you love. Richard was like Poe. Poe believed that everything that was in a poem or everything that was in a short story should focus on the mood, atmosphere, effect that he was trying to get across, the feeling that he was trying to get across. And Richard's work, no matter what he was writing, Richard's work is laser-locked on that kind of economy of structure and effect. Nothing goes to waste. I Am Legend is a very short book. I Am Legend is almost a long short story or a novella, and everything in it is important. Every word, there's not a misstep in I Am Legend. There's a reason that book was voted the most important vampire book written between Dracula and today. When a vote was taken a few years ago by the Horror Writers Association, and they were trying to decide what was the most important vampire book between us and Dracula, which is pretty much saying what is the second most important vampire novel of all time. I Am Legend was the clear winner. And, Anne Rice and Stephen King are both in that field. They both have contenders in that field. And other writers admire Richard's. I mean, readers admire Richard's work. Fans admire Richard's work. But one of the greatest admiration. There's a reason Stephen King said what he did. And I once interviewed Robert Bloch, who was very good friends with Richard and Harlan as well. He was very close to both of them. And Bob Bloch, I asked him about, sort of what advice he would give to young writers starting out. And he said something which to this day it just amazes me, because I think it's so honest. He said, there's very little that can be said about process that's of great value. But if somebody were to come up to me to say, I want to be a writer, the number one thing I would say to them is read Richard Matheson. Now, he didn't say, if somebody came up to me and said, I want to be a horror writer, or I want to be a science fiction writer, or I want to be a television writer, he just said writer. And he was saying, here is a model of what not to do and what to do. And the same thing is, don't labor your stuff with needless words. Don't look at the efficiency here. Look at the power of the chosen words and the effect. Look how careful the craftsmanship is. Richard is never going to get his due as an American writer, like most genre writers don't, until a long time after they're dead. And it takes a long time for the Academy and for the culture to catch up with them. But Richard was a great American writer, and Robert Bloch was right. You don't in any way diminish that by saying he was a great horror writer. You don't diminish it by saying he was a great science fiction writer. Richard Matheson was a great writer, period. And it's going to take a while for people to catch up to him, just as it's going to take people a long time to catch up to Stephen King. I happen to believe that Stephen King is one of the most important American writers of the last 50 years, because something Anne Rice told me once was that that Stephen King was in many ways our Dickens, in the sense that when Dickens was writing, he was not considered the great British writer of his time. If you had argued that when Dickens was at the height of his popularity, that he was the great English writer, the members of that academy would have said, you're certainly not suggesting that he's the equal of Thackeray, are you? Surely you're not saying that. Well, who reads Thackeray today? There are some, of course. There's some people, and not to say that Thackeray is not worth reading, but look at the influence. Look at the influence that Dickens has had. Look at the presence that Dickens has been, and look at the lives that Dickens has touched and the influence that he's had. And the reason is, as Anne Rice said, if you want to know what life was like on the streets of London in the 1840s, you're not going to get it from Carlyle. You're not going to get it from Thackeray. You're not going to get it from those writers who were, considered the height of the art at the time. You can only get it from Dickens. And if you want to know what life was like down at the 7-Eleven in the 1970s and 1980s, you're going to have to go to the novels of Stephen King, because he was talking about the American family and the American scene in a way that other writers weren't during that time. But it's all couched in horror. And if you write horror, you are somewhat relegated to the children's table. If you write comedy or you write horror, humor and horror are the two hardest forms to master and write well. I may have told you this the last time we talked, but there's a great quote in the introduction to Stephen King's first collection of short stories, Night Shift. And it was written by the mystery writer John D. MacDonald, who was another writer's writer, wonderful writer, wrote the Travis McGee novels. And John D. MacDonald said in that introduction that the two hardest forms of writing, and other writers understand this, the general public doesn't. They tend to give the back of the hand to these forms, but the two hardest forms to write and master at the highest level were humor and horror, because in the wrong hands, the humor became horrible and the horror became humorous. And that there were very few actual true masters of this form, and yet these were the forms we relegated to the children's table of literature, or even the sub-basement of literature. And Stephen King, like Rod Serling, Rod Serling is another one it's going to take a long time for people to catch up to Rod. Because he wrote for television, he wrote genre, and he was a celebrity. He did commercials. And that's like strike 1, 2, and 3. Well, Stephen King has got similar strikes against him. Well, I think Richard does too. And it's going to take a while for people to understand just how good a writer Richard Matheson was, and why he should be, elevated to a much higher level than where he is. It took a long time for Dickens to emerge as the great English writer, the great master. I mean, he's now considered second only to Shakespeare as the great masters of the of English literature. But that took a while. It took decades. It took decades for Poe to be, and it took basically England and France and other countries embracing him and pointing out how what a genius he was. Twain, same thing. In Twain's lifetime, there were annual polls where they would poll writers and academics and professors and such, and they would ask them to vote on the 10 great American writers of the moment. And, for a long time, Twain didn't even make the list. Well, who did make the list? People you've never heard of. People who now talk to us in a dead language. And, it wasn't even towards the end of his life that Twain starts to show up at the bottom of the list, and where, one of his best friends, one of Twain's very closest friends, was a writer named William Dean Howells. And Howells is largely forgotten today. Howells is he was called the dean of American literature. And Howells came in number 1 on one of these polls, and Twain was several places back. And Twain sent Howells a letter congratulating him and said, "You're at the head of the pack where you belong." And I'm thinking, no, he doesn't. No, he doesn't, and he ain't going to stay there long, because in a generation or two he's going to fade, and Twain's going to grow in stature. So it's probably going to take 100 years for some of these writers to be fully recognized for what they're doing and what they've done, and that's not all that odd. That's not that strange. The Poe was trying to elevate literature, and he was greatly at odds with the New England literary circles, who had somewhat of a stranglehold on what was acceptable literature. And Poe was always somewhat of an outsider. He also picked a lot of fights. Was not considered the great American poet in his lifetime. Well, who was? Well, Longfellow was. Now, Longfellow's stuff was incredibly popular in the 1830s, and Longfellow wrote these poems we call poems of the hearth. They were poems to be read aloud in front of the fireplace with a lot of feeling and a lot of spirit, and the village smitty and things like that. And Poe correctly predicted that Longfellow would not last many generations, that he would gradually fade, because this was a movement of the moment, and there was nothing that was that eternal about it. And he correctly predicted his own poetry would grow and Longfellow's would fade. And but if you made that argument in the 1840s, you wouldn't have gotten much support for it. You wouldn't have gotten many people to agree with it now. But today, everybody knows the Raven, and very few people could even tell you Longfellow's full name. So, let alone the title of one of his poems. So, like I said, I think time is on the side of people like Richard. But I'm sad to say that in your lifetime, if you choose to write this sort of thing, you're not going to be fully recognized for it. And you better, I said that, to a workshop of it was a panel at a book festival, and we had a room full of aspiring horror writers. And I said to them, know this. Know if you choose this path, you are not going to get the respect you deserve, and you are going to be relegated to the children's table when it comes to literature and writing. So you be aware of this before you go down this path, and that's it's that's part and parcel with the notion that we have separated it out, that Robert Louis Stevenson could write horror and not be penalized for it, that it would be the equal, that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was the equal of anything else he wrote, and it wasn't considered a lesser thing because of that's what he wrote. And once again, the 20th century has its way with us. And one of the things it does is it sort of, well, let me put it this way. There are a lot of people who are cases of arrested development. And that does not stop at any level of society. It exists everywhere. And the one thing that people try to replicate in their lives, almost more than anything else, and if you want to know if somebody's a case of arrested development, look at this. They try to replicate high school. Because high school is it's only 4 years for most people. It's only 4 years. But it's a very intense 4 years. High school always is magnified. Everything that happens in high school is magnified. Every glance is magnified in its meaning. Everything that happens to you is magnified. The romances of high school are magnified. Everything is like under this magnifying glass in high school. So although it's only 4 years of your life, it's a very transitional 4 years, and it's a very intense 4 years. Now, the lucky people are able to leave high school and leave it behind, whatever it was. Most people carry high school with them the rest of their lives, and they replicate it in their lives in some way. They replicate it at work. They replicate it on the school boards. They replicate it in the parking lots of the schools. They replicate it everywhere. And they immediately start setting up popular tables in the cafeteria. Everybody knew where they belonged in the caste system and the society that was high school. You knew where you belonged. Were you at the nerd table? Were you at the popular table? Were you at the jock table? Everybody knew where they belonged in high school. And for some people, that was comforting, and they want to go back to it. They want to replicate it. Well, guess what? Literary and academic types are no different than anybody else. They replicate the popular table at the cafeteria like everybody else. And they say, no, we are the people who control the popular table. You write science fiction, your place is over there. You write horror, your place is over there. And that is the case of arrested development. Now you know you're dealing with arrested development. Now, I'm saying this.
Mark,
go ahead, Mark. I'm sorry.
Mark, I just wanted to let you know we don't have 4 years of high school left. I think we're down to 30 seconds.
You're kidding! I can't believe we've gone through this fast. I feel like we just started talking.
Yeah, it does. We can't go back and add more time, but people can go to the archives. How about if you give out your website, and that's about as much time as we have left, and Barbara's going to hang up on us. And hey, you got Arlen Schumer's James Bond show tomorrow night. That's going to be a neat one. So, okay, Mark, do your thing real fast.
It's markdawidziak.com, and it's just that easy. It's just my name.com. So go take a look, and I'm on Facebook if you want to find me there.
Okay. Thank you, and we'll see you tomorrow night.